Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be starting in about 10 minutes. If anybody didn't get breakfast yet, there's still lots of food next door.
Hey, that's why I'm wearing these. I think.
I'm just going to put this water down. I'm not too worried about it.
You can correct me if I get any of the facts wrong. We still got 5 more minutes. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Good Shabbos. It's so nice to see you all and to learn together and to have this wonderful scholar in residence. I want to say a big thank you to our Adult Education Committee for putting this together alongside me. As you know, my father passed away a little over a year ago. And one of the wonderful things this congregation did was they gave some money for me to assign to use however I wanted. And I said I wanted to use it for Scholar in Residence so that his memory would be continued by that mitzvah of learning. My dad, Peter Joseph, was an amazing man. And it was important for me, whoever the scholar was going to be, was someone who knew my father. And so I put a number of names to the Education Committee, and they chose Rabbi Ken Cantor, who has known me since I was 11 years old, which dates him and dates me. He is the person that has known me longer than anybody in the United States, because he came as a student rabbi to Australia when I was 11, and then he came back again soon after my bat mitzvah. He was involved with the youth groups, and then he came back to Australia every few years and would join my family for Shabbos dinner, and really was part of, even though he was born in Chicago and studied in Cincinnati, he was really part of the Australian rabbinate that I grew up with, even though he wasn't ever an Australian rabbi. He was been in Tennessee, right? Chattanooga, Tennessee, and in Nashville. He also then went on to work at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, which for many years has trained rabbis to be rabbis, and he was in charge of the rabbinical program there. He is now the director of Roots of Reform Judaism, and is doing amazing work at that organization that really helps foster Reform Judaism around the country and provides tools for them. He also is renowned, I'm going to say you're renowned, throughout the country for the program that he is going to do this afternoon, which is the Jews of Tin Pan Alley. And that was his thesis work. He has this amazing collection and knowledge of music of that time. And he's going to be joined by Beth and Michaela this afternoon in presenting that. But today he's going to talk to us about something that relates to his current work, which is Reform Judaism, where we've been, where we are. And I know he is one of the most wonderful, sweet souls. He is so special to my family. My mother's excited to speak to him tomorrow. Her time, it's tonight our time. And he knew my dad. And so it's so special to me that he is here and I can bring him to you.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and good morning. As Rabbi Joseph was kind enough to say, I have known her most of her life, which is a great joy and privilege, and I could do an entire lecture series just on her family, but that's not what she invited me here to do. But I will talk a little bit about Peter and Margot, her parents. When I came to Australia, I was a third-year rabbinic student, and in Australia they had the tradition in Melbourne to bring in a student from, in fact, I think all of them were from Cincinnati, where her rabbi, Rabbi John Levi, had gone to school. And so they would bring a student over for a number of months. And so I came in 1977 the first time and had the very great privilege of coming back. I think the only one who came twice, and came back in 1979, then I was ordained and went to work in a congregational setting. And I was just talking to Mr. Sternheimer from your wonderful congregation, And he said, oh, my name is Sternheimer, and I had family in Nashville. And I said, oh, Harry Sternheimer? He said, that was my dad. So his dad and his mother, Anna, were very important members of our synagogue, and that I had got to know his mom because she was in our sisterhood study group. And the senior rabbi didn't want to teach that group, but I was thrilled to teach that group, and it was probably 25 women, very elderly. I think that meant 50 in my age, but I was also 28, so 50 seemed like pretty old, and up until the 80s and 90s. So that was the age group, and it was a wonderful relationship that I had with Harry and Anna, and then to meet their son here is really a gift. So, and I keep hearing all these, oh, I used to live in this place. Did you know so-and-so? Oh, yeah. And then I met one of our distinguished colleagues' parents. I don't want to blow their name out, but their last name could start with a K. Anyway, it's a great joy. Peter Joseph was one of those people who never met a stranger. And he was a guy, you know, I don't know if you knew his business. Do they know what he did for a living? But one of the things that he did was to make and then sell umbrellas, okay? And if you're ever at Rabbi's house, on the wall in their living room is a beautiful, Richard and her living room is this beautiful carved umbrella that was from Italy, but was from their house in Melbourne, which is when I walked in, I recognized it. But one of the great joys, one of my latter trips, was that Peter had created the umbrellas for the Sydney Olympics. And when I was there for dinner with Margot and Peter at their beautiful home and art collection and so on, he presented this umbrella. Now, that's a really wonderful gift until you try to figure out how the heck are you going to take it home? Because it's an umbrella. It doesn't fit into anything. Anyway, it's one of our proudest gifts from that family, but the greatest gift was the friendship that they have had and I've had for just short of 50 years, which is kind of amazing, not only from Linda and her brother and her parents, but it's really a great honor to be here. I'm reminded as I take my watch off, although I see there's a clock back there, but I remember giving a story of the church group that comes to visit the synagogue, and they sit with a person from the congregation who's sort of like their guide. And each time the rabbi would do something, like they'd do the Kiddush, and one little kid would say, what does that mean? And he'd say, well, that's the wine, blah, blah, blah. And they'd go into the prayer, blah, blah, and then the rabbi would take his watch off and put it on the table, and what did the kid say? What does that mean? And the guy from the temple said, absolutely nothing. So I've taken it off not knowing that there would be a clock to watch, so which is why Rabbi Joseph is always so on time, because she can follow along. So I want to start, as Linda said so kindly, when my time at Hebrew Union College ended, I was immediately approached by a member of the board, would I be willing to become the interim director of an organization called the Society for Classical Reform Judaism. Now, let me just say, you are exactly the right group for me to be talking about, because you have grown up at a time when some of you remember the Union Prayer Book, and some of you remember the Union Hymnal, and some of you remember all those traditions of our earlier Reform history. And so I said, yes, I'll do it for the 6 months. That was the offer. And the rest of it was, well, if you're happy and you like it, we'd love for you to stay and continue. So I did those first 6 months, and at the end of the 6 months, I said to him, you know, I would love to continue working with this organization, but frankly, the name Society for Classical Reform Judaism is a non-starter for most people in the modern time. Number one, anyone under my age doesn't know what classical reform even means. And when you say it's the Society for Classical, it sounds very snooty and very kind of off-putting. And so I said, we need to change the name, and we need to change the mission, or at least broaden the mission. And hence it became Roots of Reform Judaism, because even if you don't like what classical reform represented all those years ago, you cannot argue that that is where Reform Judaism of today began. So I'm going to begin with a story about actually reading a speech from a man whose name you should know. His name was Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. And along with being a rabbi who came from Germany and came to America, he is given credit as the founder of organizational Reform Judaism in America. He came from Bavaria, came over to the United States, became the rabbi in Albany, New York, ironically at the temple he grew up in for a little while. He was the creator of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. He was the creator of the Hebrew Union College. He was the founder of the CCAR, the rabbis, I don't know, I guess you'd call it the union, but it's the Central Conference of American Rabbis. He was the rabbi who started the rabbinical school in Cincinnati, where Rabbi Joseph was a proud alumna. And one of my old friends, known to many of you, also was trained at that same school, a man by the name of Seth Bernstein. And I want to say to tribute to his kindness, he emailed me a couple days ago and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I can't be there with the congregation for your weekend, but I'm up in New York with his son, whom you know is dealing with some very serious health issues." But it was typically Seth, the kind of mensch that he is, that he would reach out and say, "Hey, I'm really sorry. I'm going to miss getting to be with you." Anyway, the point is that I served for just short of 20 years as the head of the rabbinical school in Cincinnati, after having been a rabbi for 25 years of my own, as Linda said, in both Nashville and Chattanooga, Tennessee. So my whole rabbinate is in the South. And then one of the other programs I'm not doing tonight, but I did just a couple weeks ago, is called "Is It True What They Sing About Dixie?" All of the songs of which were written by Jews, none of whom had ever been at Dixie. They're all writing from Brooklyn or wherever in New York they live. Anyway, neither here nor there. So here is a text that was spoken by Isaac Mayer Wise 2 years before he created the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and 4 years before he opened the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And I want you to listen to these words in an essay he wrote that is called "The Rabbi." Now, let me just start with gender issues were not an issue in 1872 when he wrote these, or 1870 actually, because rabbis were men. So you put the terminology in there of women, of male or female, but listen to the description. He said, and by the way, he wrote this just about 100 years before the ordination of the first Reform woman rabbi, Rabbi Sally Presant, in 1972. He quoted this: "The rabbi is the teacher in Israel, no more and no less. Judaism knows nothing of a mediating priest standing between God and man. Intelligence and conscience are the arbiters of faith. The rabbi's claim upon the respect of the community is based on intellectual superiority, acquaintance with Jewish learning, purity of character, enthusiasm for the cause which he or she serves. And if the rabbi is lacking in any of these gifts of grace, that is no rabbi, however good, however pious, however charitable or clever. The rabbi's duty is to teach from the pulpit, in the school, and for the family. The rabbi must be a person of goodwill. The rabbi must conciliate wherever possible, must always be strong in the declaration of truth, without fear or favor." Who does that describe? She's sitting right there. And she was preceded by Seth Bernstein as well. And it's fascinating to know that in the first ordination class of 5 students, one of them, the brightest, we are told, was a woman. But her parents wouldn't let her be ordained because, and I quote, That's not a job for a nice Jewish girl. And it took a century to ordain that first nice Jewish girl. So I'm going to talk to you today, this morning, about two areas. And by the way, let me just explain my little boo-boo. That's what my grandson calls it, boo-boo. I'm the cook in my home. My wife is the dishwasher and cleaner-upper. Great deal, by the way, let me just say. And last week we had a dinner for her colleagues where she worked for many years at Jewish Hospital in Cincinnati. I was cooking the dinner and was slicing potatoes and got one of the instruments I urge you not to purchase, which is called a mandolin. You know what that is? And so I'm slice. Everything's doing great. I had one extra slice that I didn't want to have. When we went to the emergency room after the dinner, we had the dinner, lovely time. They all went home. We went straight to the emergency room. The nurse, looked at my finger and said, "Mandolin, right?" I said, so anyway, it's no worse than that, but it is kind of, anyway, a problem when you're typing. It's an issue. So let us begin with understanding what makes Reform Judaism Reform Judaism. And we're going to begin with how, in the earlier tradition of your days, when you were young people, if you were at Reformed temples, there were certain things that you could expect to see. And Rabbi Joseph said when I came in to visit this really extraordinary building that you have here with all the communities, and we're walking in and before services, and this is not meant as a value statement, just interesting, that you could tell the difference in the people who are going to be at the Reconstructionist service versus your service. Because all of us have grown up with a sense of how one came to synagogue or to temple. You were dressed appropriately, whereas other traditions, that's not a custom that they have quite as well. But if you were to go to see a synagogue of a generation ago, number one, you would expect, or 2 generations ago, number one, you would expect to see the Union Prayer Book, which had certain great gifts. One of them, it was small. It was much lighter than the later Reformed prayer books. It was written primarily in English and Hebrew, mostly English, some Hebrew. And by the way, if you looked earlier, the first Reformed prayer books was written in German and Hebrew. And it is fascinating being here in Columbia that one of your next door neighbors in Baltimore still does a Yom Kippur service in German in the afternoon service as a tribute and homage to the beginnings of that community's worship experience. One of the other things you would have seen, well, the rabbi would be in a robe, looking very official, maybe even ministerial, if you want me to use that word. There wouldn't be a yarmulke, a kippah in that day. The choreography was very formal, very official, and some of it was, as quoting a teacher that Rabbi Joseph and I both had, the children of Israel were not born of darkness, we come of light because we are Jews. We are not a product of yesterday, but the flowering of 100 generations of Jews who taught great things that we might live better. And who wrote that? Dr. Jacob Rader Marcus, the founder of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. So what was and what is Reform Judaism? What brings you here and not to another congregational setting? Well, one of them was Reform Judaism is a philosophy. It's more than a theology. It's more than a set of beliefs about God. It is a way of thinking about our Judaism and our heritage that has been passed down by as radical reformers as David Einhorn and as moderate as Isaac Mayer Wise. Reform Judaism, as you know, was founded in Germany 200 years ago, in the year 1810. Founded in a community called Ziesen, by a man named Israel Jacobson, a great scholar and professor of his day. But it matured in the United States. It is truly, Reform Judaism is an American Judaism. And it grew in the early part of the 19th century. And why is that? It's because the Germans came from Germany to America. at this same period. It's why the great Reformed temples were in cities with high percentages of German population. Cincinnati, where he put the rabbinical school that was not just rabbinical school for Reform rabbis, but for everybody. Why was it called the Hebrew Union College? That it should unite all the Jews of America. And it was in Cincinnati because Cincinnati was the second biggest Reform community in America, which is fascinating, and this is in the 1800s. And what was their gift? What did it mean to be a Reformed Jew? We'll talk about it. One of them was the authority and the opportunity for each one of us to find our own meaning in Judaism for ourselves. It was not something that you had to separate from society to be a good Jew. It meant living as citizens in the nations where we resided. One of the great questions of the middle of the 20th century was the term, are we American Jews or Jewish Americans? And that's a question that all of you may have thought of over the years. But the fact was that it was a Judaism influenced by the Enlightenment, by science, by scholarship, by the learning of our communities around us. And boy, no one has a better example of that appreciation of diversity of scholarship and of faith and of learning than you in this building and what it represents. It recognized that Jews had to be educated and acculturated, but not assimilated. That they could be Jews and proud of their identity and at the same time be part of a society and of a community. And it means another thing. Why is it that every 30 years the Reform movement comes out with a new prayer book? Not only because it sells copies, that's a good reason, but more than that, because it is that every generation has to search for its own language in which to pray. And it may have been 50 years ago that that language was English, or maybe more as the generations have passed, more and more Hebrew. I know that Rabbi Joseph is involved in the newest iteration of our prayer book that you're all going to be part of. And she was gracious enough to tell me about it when I came yesterday. But we understand that all of us are standing on the shoulders of those who were before us, and that every generation will know that there will be the next generation that will be standing on where we are today as they build to the future. So what were the key elements? What are the key elements of great Reform heritage? Well, one of them I mentioned already, decorum. You could always tell the difference between the Reform temple and the Orthodox synagogue across the street, right? When you went to services, number one, you were better dressed because you're going to temple. Number two, there wasn't the chatter, well, I don't know about here, but the chatter, during all through services that there would be in the Orthodox community. Part of it, by the way, was their service was 3 or 4 hours long. And after a while, you needed to get up and take a walk or whatever you did. But the recognition is that the Union Prayer Book was to speak to the people of their day in language they understood, and yet language that would change. From the 1893 First Union Prayer Book to the 1940 last new edition of the Union Prayer Book, the first one, if you opened it today, you'd be a little surprised that it had responsive reading, all those things you know, but the person who was listed as the reader wasn't called the rabbi. What was the reader called? The minister. So in the first of the prayer books written in 1893, published in 1893, it listed the rabbi as a minister. Okay, it's fascinating, the changes. But it combined the progressivism of America with the intellectual leadership of the prophetic Judaism, which is why it is not Reformed Judaism, it is Reform Judaism, which means it continues to reform and to change and to experience the modernity of one generation after another. Reform Judaism from its very beginning was a place that allowed a spectrum of ideas. And I sat there last night at the beautiful service that Rabbi Joseph led and her musical team, and the profound sermon that she gave last night. I looked at all these windows and recognized that they're gorgeous in their own, but that they recognize the spectrum of ideas of our own Jewish tradition and of the other traditions in this building. That it could go all the way from strong proponents of Zionism to all the other end of the American Council for Judaism, founded before World War II in pretty much opposition to the creation of a Jewish state. It was all the way from progressive revelation to the Yiddishkeit and Hasidism of our prayer book. There's all these prayers from Hasidic rabbis in the Reformed prayer book. Whoever thought that was a good idea? But the fact is that that showed the diversity of worship in our Reformed tradition, that it could go all the way from the great Reform rabbis of the 1890s to the Hasidic Rebbe of the 1700s and the 1800s. Now, don't get confused that somehow our Reformed Judaism only allowed for certain worship traditions, because that intellectual honesty led to creative worship. I'm going to tell you a great story. I was interviewing for a job after I was an assistant rabbi, and in those days, assistant rabbis served for 3 years, and it was called the 3 years and out rule, which meant that after 3 years, every assistant rabbi had to leave the Reformed temple to find another job. So I was interviewing for another position, my first solo position or senior position. And I went to this beautiful congregation, brand new building, just gorgeous, in a Midwestern city. And I walked in, and it was a lovely place, and I'm looking around, and there wasn't a single painting or picture or poster on the wall of this building, and they'd been in it for 3 or 4 years. And I said to someone, you have such a lovely building, but how come there's no Judaica, there's no art? And they said, oh, Rabbi, we've never found a painting we all liked. Red flag number 1. And then I had a meeting with the ritual committee. Don't let them do this to you, Rabbi Joseph. And I said, well, what prayer book do you use? Oh, our rabbi writes a new service every week. And I said, well, why is it? Well, we've never found a prayer book we all like. Now, it didn't take a chacham to figure out if they can't find a painting they all like, they're not likely to find a rabbi they all like either. And so, remarkably, they offered me the job, and I said, well, I need a day or two to talk to my wife about this. I get to the hotel. I didn't need to call anybody, and I just, the next morning said, I thank you so much for this privilege, this honor, but I don't think that, this is the community that I could best serve as the rabbi. Anyway, we won't go into who they hired or how long he lasted, but nonetheless, it was one of those things that if you're going to speak to the diversity of a community, as yours is, you have to have a key word with diversity, and that's community. And you have them both. And that's a remarkable blessing of this congregation, of what Bet Aviv stands for. Now, some of you probably have heard of the French philosopher Edmund Flegg. You know that name? Well, you'll know something that he wrote. And he wrote this letter to his grandson, who was not yet born, but he wanted this to be the lesson for his little grandchild yet to be born. And this is what he wrote. I am a Jew. And he wrote this. I am a Jew because the faith of Israel demands no abdication of my mind. I am a Jew because the faith of Israel asks every possible sacrifice of my soul. I am a Jew because in all places where there are tears and suffering, Jews weep. I am a Jew in every age when the cry of despair is heard. The Jew hopes. I am a Jew because the message of Israel is the most ancient and the most modern. I am a Jew because Israel's promise is a universal promise. I am a Jew because for Israel the world is not finished. Men and women will complete it. I am a Jew because Israel places humanity and God's unity above nations and above Israel itself. And last of all, I am a Jew because above humanity, the image of the divine unity, Israel places the unity which is divine. And if you think about those, and by the way, that was written by Flegg in 1915. Think about that, over 110 years ago. And yet most of those words could be well understood by all of us. Now I know, if you remember nothing about what I said this morning, this is what you're going to remember. Okay? Just, you can hold me to it. Because some of the challenges that Reformed Judaism has faced over these last 100 and some years is that, Reformed Judaism is assimilationism. Or worse, Reformed Judaism is Judaism light. Judaism is the default for those who don't care about their Judaism. And here's what you're going to remember. To define Reform, conservative, and Orthodox, here's the three-word definition: lazy, hazy, and crazy. Now see, you're going to walk out of there and say, I don't remember anything he said, but lazy, hazy, and crazy I can remember. But that was the reality of Jewish community. That, I'm at the Orthodox synagogue, and those are the lazies in it, right? And so your rabbis, the history of this congregation, are representative of the Reform heritage that is so rich as part of our background and our history of the past, and yet what is truly relevant and meaningful in the future. So I would bet, having been at services last night, that if I were to say to you the following sentence, that many of you in this room could finish the rest of this prayer without opening a prayer book. And it starts like this: May the time not be distant, O God, when thy name shall be worshiped. How many of you know that prayer? Right? That is one of the oldest prayers in Mishkan Tefillah because it came from the 1892 Union Prayer Book. And it's still one of those prayers that we, who weren't even a glimmer in some grandparent's eye in 1892, can still remember because it was so much a part of our liturgy, that prayer is something that has withstood the period of time, that it's been revised a little bit. In the most recent one, it's a little bit different. It says there, let the time not be distant, O God, when all shall turn to you in love, when corruption and evil shall give way to integrity and goodness. But that's pretty close to those 1892 words. Here's another one that was in the prayer book last night. It starts like this: grant us peace, thy most precious gift. Keep going. O thou eternal source of peace, and enable Israel to be a messenger of peace unto all the peoples of the earth. Written 1892. Before the Zionist movement even existed, and 100 years before Reform. Well, that's not right. Reform existed, but it hadn't grown to the role that it plays now. So my point to you is simply, that's a second of the prayers that have withstood our tradition. But one of the other things that have been so powerful for us to understand was something that Rabbi was kind enough to share with me in advance, and that is the music of our tradition. So let me begin with what do you think of as Jewish music? Well, maybe you'll think of Ein Keloheinu, Ein, right? How many of you know that one? Yeah? Okay, or Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala. I see they're all singing along. I don't even know if you sing those anymore, but you remember them. But the fact is that Jewish music began 2,000 years before those songs were written. And the first of Jewish music was chanting the Torah. So when you hear the cantillation of Torah chant, you recognize that the chanting was created, as I said, 2,000 years ago. Rabbi Joseph and Rabbi Bernstein and I all had a professor who was so knowledgeable. And one of the things that was fascinating is that cantillation is different depending on where you grew up. If you lived in Poland, cantillation was a certain melody. If you lived in Damascus, it was a different melody, even though the markings, the cantillation markings, were exactly the same. And this professor of ours at HUC was so knowledgeable that he used to say if you dropped him by helicopter anywhere in the world and he listened to Torah chanting, he would know exactly where he was because he knew all of that liturgical style. Now, how many of you had bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah where you maybe did a Torah chanting? Raise your hand. Okay. I'm guessing that almost everyone in here who learned bar bat mitzvah after the 1950s had what became, we understand, as the Israeli cantillation, that certain melody, which I don't know what Rabbi Joseph taught in her earlier years with Sunday school children, but that was the style that pretty much in America, that's what they used, okay? However, if you grew up before that, it could be a plethora of religious choices, all of them different, but all of them using the same markings. Now, how many of you have looked inside a Torah? Okay. What did you notice was missing inside the Torah? Vowels. And also, more complicated, no punctuation marks. So when Rabbi goes to school and studies this stuff for her in Bible study, part of it was to learn where the punctuation goes. Because there are no verses, there are no chapters, right? They're just spaces in the case of the books. Well, the fact was that Torah chanting was the very first Jewish music. And we even know how it sounded because we know the markings, okay? The second great groupings were the music of the Bible. Now, all of you who like orchestra music, or who like choral music, or who like big band music, they had all that stuff in the Bible. And we know that because in the book of Psalms, as the heading of some of the books, it will say by the orchestra of Gittit, or the choir of so-and-so. It would identify who and what kind of musical styles they used for each of these psalms. So we know in ancient worship, if you went, you might not hear anybody as good as Beth chanting. Of course, it wouldn't have been a woman and then anyway, but besides which, but even one of the things that we learned, that by the time of the Talmud, they had mixed choirs of men and women, and believe it or not, they had an organ. And it's in the Talmud that they had organ music amongst the instruments that was kosher music in the synagogue of that time. And if you want to study Reform Judaism and learn the fighting that Reform temples had when they introduced the organ to the music worship, you will be surprised that all they were doing was being more traditional than the Orthodox. You can quote me on that too. All right, anyway. Antiphonal music, right? As you did not in music, but in prayer last night when we shared all the different simchas in your lives. And what do you say at the end of each one of those prayers? Modima nachnu lach. Well, you could be singing it as well as saying it, but that's antiphonal worship. That was a Jewish tradition as well. One of the things that I find so fascinating, how many of you ever heard of Gregorian chants? Okay, where do you think that came from? It came from cantorial music. It was lifted by the church on the basis of the singing, the chazanut, or if you're of a certain generation, the chazanas, that you heard, and they picked it up and created the Gregorian chants from early biblical chanting that we've talked about already. And we move into another section that we don't even think about as Jewish music, but it was the music of the Renaissance. And one of the things that you can find now, and maybe sometime you'll get to hear, is the music of compositions written in the 13th and 14th centuries, Jewish music in Hebrew from this early Renaissance period. I think Leone is the earliest one that I think is published regularly, and he was in the 1600s. But in fact, some of you are familiar with a man by the name of Meir Leone, who wrote a song called the Yigdal. Remember, you know the Yigdal, right? Well, the Christians thought, ooh, that's a good song. And they stole it, and they renamed it the God of Abraham Praise. But it's the same melody, bum, bum, ba, bum, 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 right? Yigdal Elohim Chai. And so they took our tradition, not all of them, but this Christian songwriter took that great melody. Or how about this one? If it goes like this, bum, 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 bum. What's that one called? Ma'os Tzur, right? Which is in English, Rock of Ages. Well, the Christians took that one also. And they did bum, ba, bum, 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 ba, bum. What's that? Rock of Ages, right? So we have in its own way a musical ping pong game. We stole something of theirs, they stole something of ours, but all of that is part of the Jewish traditional of music that we think about. But here are the ones that you're not going to be as familiar with, and I think are so fascinating. As an example, last night we sang a song called the Shema, right? Shema Yisrael, right? Who wrote that? Well, if I asked most people, God wrote it. But no, it was Solomon Zulzer, who was in fact writing from his pulpit in Vienna, where he was a chazan, a cantor. And he was the first cantor whom we know about who commissioned a great Christian composer to write music for the synagogue. And who was that? He wrote his friend and student, a young man whose name was Franz Schubert. And so here is Zulzer hiring Schubert to write psalms for the synagogue. And I think the only one that I've ever heard was the 92nd Psalm that Schubert wrote. Another one, living in Paris, and I'm trying to show you the diversity of the composers of our people in the 18th and 19th century, was Samuel Naumburg, who was in Paris, or Louis Lewandowski, whose music you'll know quite well, in Berlin, or Julius Freudenthal, also writing in the 1870s. And if we move forward, you think of contemporary music, and I'm going to talk in a moment about all the music from last night to give you a sense of the historical definition of where these people wrote. But one of them you think about, you know, the contemporary music of folk or popular music. I don't know how many of you saw the Bob Dylan movie that came out, I guess, last year, A Complete Unknown. But there's a nice Jewish guy from Hibbing, Minnesota, who kind of went on to a successful career, I think you could say. Or Debbie Friedman, whose name I'm sure you know. And we talk about the influence of Israel on music, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, but you think of Shlomo Carlebach or Nurit Hirsch. Remember, you know, V'ha'ar Ereneinu b'tohara, you know that one? Shlomo Carlebach, and I think you'll smile at this. When I was in rabbinical school, Carlebach not only was a teacher and kind of a guru, he owned the first pizza store in Jerusalem. And we used to go there, and he would be there. He's, you know, flipping pizzas, and he was out there working the crowd. So my knowledge of Shlomo Carlebach is a lot more messy than most of us who think of it as musically. But the fact is that this music of the Hasidic tradition is now a part of our Jewish music, whatever denominational group or stream that you come from. And all you have to think of is one of the most popular songs of this last 20 years, which is Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, which has been rewritten and revised, and the words have been changed for all sorts of uses. But here is a Jewish guy named Leonard Cohen writing this song that has become so ubiquitous in our music experience of the last 20 years, certainly. Well, we have to talk a little bit about klezmer music. So what is klezmer? Is it Jewish? No. It's Eastern European, and it was taken and made a part of Jewish worship as well. And that was the clarinet and that kind of crying sound of the klezmer music and the style of instrumentation. The klezmer music had Yiddish lyrics in its foundation, and it was used primarily not for worship at all, but for dance music at simchas. So that's where the klezmer band would play, and the people would dance. And it is fascinating. This is not part of my lecture of great importance, but it's interesting to me. The very first Grammy for Jewish music was given to the Klezmatics, whose name you may or may not remember, for the album that they wrote that combined the lyrics of Woody Guthrie and the music of their klezmer tradition. And it won, as I said, the very first Grammy for Jewish music. It's not classical music, but synagogue kind of music. So I want to thank you for the privilege of being here this morning and then this afternoon and talk about these great composers. As I mentioned, Solomon Zulzer, who at the age of 22, he was really advanced from us, became the chief cantor of Vienna at 22 years old. Amazing. He became the professor at the Imperial Conservatory and was knighted by the Austro-Hungarian Emperor for his gift to music. And when he was ultimately appointed the maestro of the National Academy of St. Cecilia in Rome, where he was entitled the father of the modern cantorate. Now, what made him so interesting? Well, number one, he had extraordinary musical scholarship. He was not only a cantor who could chant music, but his musicology, his knowledge was vast. And he became a teacher of future cantors as well, not in the same period of time of teaching, but at the same time they both lived was Louis Lewandowski, right? And you know his music, because if you grew up in any synagogue, Orthodox or Reform, maybe even some, conservative as well, the music that he did is so well known of music, and when Rabbi gets a chance, she'll point him out. Do any of his music anymore? Yes. Okay, so some of it you would be familiar with. Oh, always. I was going to say, always ask a co-president. They know all these things. Anyway, so Lewandowski was a teacher of cantors of the Reform movement. And by the time of his death in 1892, he became the creating force behind the Pestalozzistrasse synagogue in Germany, in Berlin, that to this day, if you go to Shabbat next Friday, the music they do is all Lewandowski. And that's what they're famous for, this Reform temple in Berlin. It's fascinating to me. His daughter, tragically, her name was Martha, died in Theresen concentration camp. And he has a son who outlived her, but this was one of the great names of our Reformed Jewish heritage in music. Another one was Adolf Kachko, who was from Poland. So here you have Vienna, Berlin, and Poland, these three great centers of Jewish life and learning in the 19th century, who became a cantor in Manhattan at a Upper West Side synagogue called Anshe Chesed, and his curriculum became what was taught at the Hebrew Union College School of Sacred Music. This conservative Polish cantor's music is the foundation of what every Reformed cantor has studied since the creation of this music in the 1940s, which I think is so interesting. As I mentioned, there's the second group. That's the classical bunch. Now we go to the Israeli bunch. How many of you have been to Israel? Almost all of you. I think that's marvelous. When you go to Israel, you will see in synagogue world, all through this broad knowledge of Jewish music. Rabbi talked about it last night with the Eurovision song, which would not be synagogue music, but nonetheless is Jewish music and Israeli music that is known to so many people. But as I mentioned to you, if I were to sing or you were to hear Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, remember, you know that one? Yeah. Who wrote that? An Israeli songwriter by the name of Naomi Shemer. And of course, Shlomo Karabach that I mentioned to you already. And another one that you would know probably was Tzvika Pick, who is a modern composer still writing now. He was a TV star before he was a songwriter. He was a Eurovision winner, seems to be a running theme in our weekend, in 1998. And more importantly, in my thinking, he wrote the songs for 5 other Eurovision countries with their competitors competing against Israel. So here's an Israeli songwriter writing for all these other countries to defeat the Israeli songwriter. Anyway, nonetheless, of course, you think of his as the Shechianu as one of his most famous pieces. And now we move, the center of music is no longer Europe. And the center of music, in terms of liturgical music, is no longer Israel. Because now the center of music of our tradition is here in America. And I'm going to give you 2 names that you're going to know, I think, I hope so. One of them is Samuel Adler. Now, why did I use his name? Because we sang his piece last night. And Samuel Adler was born in Mannheim, Germany. He's 98 years old, and he's someone I know very, very well because his nephew was our professor of Bible at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, David Aaron. And Samuel Adler was the son of another musician whose name you will not know, but whose greatest creation you will know. His name was Hugo Adler, and he wrote the Union Hymnal. Remember that big red book with all the songs in it? Some of you old enough will remember that. So here is Samuel Adler, who studied under Herbert Fromm, one of the other great composers of mid-century Jewish music. He then went to Harvard, where he studied with Aaron Copland and Serge Koussevitzky, you probably heard of their names, with his classmate, Leonard Bernstein. I remember when the Bernstein movie came out, I called him up and said, Sam, what'd you think of the movie? He said, it's the stupidest movie you ever saw. I said, why is that? He said, all they talked about was his personal life. Who cares about that? I want to hear them talk about his music. I said, it's not a documentary. It's a movie that they want to sell tickets to. He wasn't too pleased. Anyway, Samuel Adler, composer, conductor, teacher. He was a professor at Eastman School of Music and then at Juilliard. And at 98, he's composing every day. And last year at 97, he flew to Mannheim, to Germany, where they opened the Samuel Adler Concert Hall, and he conducted the Mannheim Orchestra in a suite of his orchestral music at 97 years old. Another one, Michael Isaacson, another whose name you'll know, and interestingly, was a student of Samuel Adler at the Eastman School of Music. So all these people kind of tie together. He is credited with inventing what we call Jewish summer camp music, right? He preceded Debbie Friedman, just put it that way. And he wrote Sim Shalom and Bayom Hahu and the Ne'emar, done last night in your service. He is famous for having been offered the greatest commission of a Jewish songwriter ever when 43 conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionist synagogues commissioned him to write a Shabbat service that all of them would use on the same Friday night, all around the United States. And it's called Lema'aseh Bereshit, to recreate the world. And so here was, on a meta sense, the kind of community working together that you're doing right here. And as I said, who published it? I didn't say who, but who published it? Our own Reform Music Publishing House, the largest in the world publishing Jewish music, called Transcontinental. And that's who did this book. Now, I'm going to be really selfish on this next one because it really made me happy that 3 of the songs used last night were all written by songwriters whom I commissioned. Now, this is not a Ken's a great guy. I happen to be in one of the great musical locations in the world for songwriters called Nashville, Tennessee. Now, it will maybe surprise you. I'll just tell you a couple of those music stories. One of them, I get a phone call from Los Angeles. And this gentleman says to me, I have a client who will be in Nashville recording an album, and he would like to come to your services for Rosh Hashanah. How much are your tickets? And I said, well, we don't charge for tickets. We'd be delighted to have him. Who is it? He says, oh, Rabbi, I can't tell you. I said, well, so what good is it for me to know that he's coming if I don't know his name? He says, oh, don't worry, Rabbi. When he shows up, you'll know. Okay. So I'm watching it, 400 or 500 people at services, and where the bima is situated, I can see the front door, and I know everybody going through. And finally, this old bald guy with glasses comes in, and I says, okay, I guess that's him, but I don't know who it is. He sits down. We open with the first opening song. He starts singing. 400 heads turn to him, Neil Diamond, but without his hairpiece. So he comes up after the service and he says, Rabbi, I love the service. Can I come tomorrow? I said, we would be honored to have. Can I give you an aliyah? He says, oh, no, Rabbi. He says, I'm just a Jew in the pew. I said, Mr. Diamond, you are not just a Jew in the pew. He said, well, do you have time for lunch with me this week? Ask Rabbi Joseph. The craziest week of the year is between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I said, of course I can have lunch with you. What day works? I'll make any day you want. So we go to Nashville's deli, which if you've ever been to Nashville, the deli is called Nashville. Very clever. And the two of us have lunch as if I were having lunch with any of you. Just a regular, menschy, nice guy in his 70s at that time. And he said, can I come back for Yom Kippur? And of course he could. So he came back. And we had the privilege of at least recognizing him like this is the worst kept Jewish secret in America, that Neil Diamond was at our services. Anyway, we used to have that situation quite often. But one of the things that we had that was marvelous was all of these young people coming to Nashville to try to break into the music world, not necessarily country music, but music. And 3 of them were in the service last night. Stacy Beyer. When I was the assistant rabbi at the temple, she was writing songs for us then. Dan Nichols, whom some of your families, or children, grandchildren would know, who wrote the Michamocha last night, and Michael Oakes, who I just did a concert with last week, who wrote the Modim Anachnu Lach that you sang last night, all of them from the temple in Nashville, Tennessee. So you can thank all those Southern Jews for those 3 great songs. And the last grouping we had in our service last night is the music of today, these younger composers, although Michael, well, no, neither he nor Dan are as young as some of these people. Noah Aronson, who you had a couple pieces of his last night, went to the Berklee School of Music in Boston, one of the fine conservatories in the United States, was in rabbinical school at the Hebrew College, and briefly in Boston, didn't finish. But he's the one from last night who did the Baruch Hu, the very beginning kind of English and Hebrew introduction of the service, and he did the Adonai Tzvatai service music that we did last night as well. Another, Alana Arian. She comes from sort of rabbinical royalty because she's got parents who are just as prominent, if not more so, in the Jewish world than she has become, but she is a composer and a studio musician. She began doing touring artists with folk singers. And then she kind of went on to her own career, worked with PBS and worked with NPR, and is on the faculty right now at the Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music at HUC, a marvelously talented woman. And then one more that we talked about that you heard last night, who did the Kimitzion that we did at the service. What's interesting about Jessie Romer is that while she's from DC and comes from an American traditional background, she's a composer in Ladino, in Yiddish, in Sephardic, Middle Eastern, Ashkenazic music, all of these different styles, and was ordained in the Aleph movement as a rabbi, and as I said, did this Kimitzion last night for our service. So what does all of this have in common? Not lazy, hazy, and crazy, but talented, gifted, inspiring, because that's what Reform Judaism has always been, be it the liturgy of 120 years ago that we still use today, or the music of 2,000 years ago and 200 years ago and written last week. It is all still part of our Jewish ritual tradition. This afternoon, so I hope you'll continue to stick around, will be a much lighter in tone program, but equally important because if it weren't for the Jewish songwriters of America, we would not have Broadway. We would not have American popular music. And as you will see in our program tonight, when we do music from the very beginnings of Reform in the 1890s, all the way to the period of just before World War II, we'll share in yet this other gift of Judaism and of Reform Judaism to our people, to our country, to our world. I'm going to end with one wonderful story that I may remind myself and tell it later, but I was doing a program at the Golden Age Home, Jewish Golden Age Home in Sydney, Australia. And unlike here, where the food is set up behind a curtain, behind a divider, they had the oneg set up right behind me. Like 4 long tables of sweets and 600 older people sitting watching the sweets. And when the program was over, 599 of them rushed to the table with all the goodies, except for one little old lady who came over to me. She said, "Rabbi Kanta, I really enjoyed your program, but Frank Sinatra, you're not." So be it. Thank you very much.
Does anybody have any questions for Rabbi Kanta? Of course,
No. You're the second question. Who wants to be the first? No, I'm just teasing.
So, Rabbi, this is a wonderful talk you gave, and my guess is the musical tradition you're talking about would also appeal to young Reform Jews or Jews who are moved away from the movement. So, could you speak to what you think is how the Reform movement or Judaism as a whole might be able to get Jews who are not affiliated or marginally affiliated to get more engaged?
It's a great question, but I think it's a broader question than that. And that is the generation of my kids, your kids, maybe your grandchildren, tend not to be joiners. And that's across all sorts of things. Clubs, organizations, political institutions, all these sorts of things. What we're dealing with now, remember I was a congregational rabbi up until just a few years ago, and dealing with the fact that we have done a not good job in teaching our kids to become continuing parts of synagogues, of synagogue life. And by the way, that goes with churches as well. They're all having the same issues. And by the way, it's carried in a very focused answer, because this has been my life for the last 20 years, in getting people to go to rabbinical school. We're seeing numbers drop in rabbinical schools, but also in the ministry. And we're seeing all of that as a reality that we haven't done well in teaching them to become part of congregational worlds. We have the newest thing that we never had when Rabbi Joseph and I were growing up, and it's sort of like a la carte Judaism. You know, I don't join a synagogue because it has all these things, some of which I don't want, but someone else does, so I want to support them. We have now the reality of, well, I'll join because it has one thing, or I won't join because it's doing all these other issues. That's a big problem. The music issue, there's another thing that's interesting. It used to be for us, you would go to synagogue to hear this music and be inspired and uplifted by it, as you were if you were here last night, and every week, every time you have services. But now, most of the music that any young person wants, they can get it online. And they can do it at home. And by the way, you know what was the cause of that huge drop of attendance? COVID. When we had all those years when everyone learned, oh, I can stay home and sit in my jammies with my nice fluffy slippers and a glass of wine and watch services. And then turn them off and leave or whatever. That was another of the, I wouldn't say downfall, but certainly challenge of membership in synagogue life. I do believe that young people today have the option to have way more Jewish music than any of us did as young people, because they can listen to anything they want online, and they can watch it on, you know, all the social media options that they have. So I don't know that there is less music available that they're knowing, but I do know it's a much broader area for them to learn the music. Now, by the way, if you're interested, I'm not doing a plug for my organization except for one thing. If you're interested in some of this great music, our website is called rootsofreform.org. And you can skip all the sermons and skip all the, we have service, all sort of stuff. But there's a whole section of music done by cantors and choirs of, and it's all free. Just get online and listen to it. It's really inspirational that I think some of you will like it. So rootsofreform.org, okay? All this music that we've been talking about is all available for you, of cantors and cantorial soloists and choirs. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to be an addendum to what you just said, because I was an educator with the state for many, many years. I think I told you this.
You did.
But I worked with the Milken Foundation, and the Milken Foundation was the first to come out and give a and this is 25 years ago or more, $25,000 to a teacher, a wonderful teacher, and that teacher didn't apply, had no idea they were going to win this. It was others that recommended that teacher. So it was totally amazing, and I got to know them and work with them. I'm just wondering what you think of their music archives, which are supposed to be phenomenal.
Yeah, the Milken Foundation gave a great deal of money to the Museum of, what's it called in Tel Aviv? It's got a new name. Yeah, it used to be called the Diaspora Museum. It's got another name now. But they, the Milken people gave a very large 7-figure gift, maybe 8-figure, I don't know how much, to this museum that maybe some of you saw in Tel Aviv. If you ever saw the Museum of the Diaspora, it has a new name now and a new, pretty much new building. But they created and recorded hundreds of hours of music, some of them of people I've talked about. Lewandowski has his own album, CD, so on, so on, so on, but also rare music. So it's a remarkable reference for us and resource for us, absolutely. But unfortunately, it's not video, it's just CDs. So that's what, some of these things are nice because they're videos as well. You know, it's a DVD. Yes, sir.
So, going back to the history of Reform Judaism, when you talk about the rabbis who started in 1810, I believe, what were they seeking to specifically reform?
Well, I think they didn't call themselves Reform Jews yet, but they were trying to, by creating more and more customs that fit the social world they live in. I'm going to say one thing that it's a gross generality, but I think it's true. Reform Judaism has always been an urban Judaism, and Orthodoxy has always been at least a rural or at least small shtetl Judaism, okay? So Jacobson, living in a fairly good-sized, sophisticated German city, wanted to bring his synagogue custom, the minhagim of the synagogue, to be more representative or at least more inclusive of the tradition of his neighbors, okay? So he didn't say, he did certain big changes. One of them was to have men and women sitting together. That was radical in 1810. That's radical now for some communities. He looked at, within the first 20 years, don't hold me to the date, but soon, the introduction of the sermon in the vernacular, meaning in the language of the country. One of the great stories that I remember from my own experience, a woman by the name of Iphigene Ox Sulzberger, whose name you may not know, but her father, her husband, her son, her grandson, her great-grandson are all the owners of the New York Times. And she was on the board of HUC, coming from New York City, and she goes to a board meeting in Jerusalem, and she's sitting next to the dean, Spice Handler, in Jerusalem, and she's quite put out. And she said, well, why are they doing this whole service in Hebrew? Why aren't they doing it in the vernacular? And he says, Mrs. Sulzberger, this is Israel. That is the vernacular. Anyway, so the preaching in the language of the people was an early reform, shall we say, so that the sermons, instead of being Hebrew or were in the language of the people. And so that's another of these early changes, and there were a number of those. The introduction of the organ, which wasn't being done before that, was restored, as I said, from Talmudic times to the 19th century in Germany. So those were the early, they were more stylistic changes, I think I would say. The philosophical things are later than Jacobson was trying to do. Okay? Yes, yes, ma'am.
I have 3 granddaughters who are college students. One a junior and the other 2 sophomores. And what I hear from them, and they grew up with exposure to religious services, one conservative, 2 reform, is that the draw when they get to college is basically Chabad. What is being done by the reform movement to entice, encourage our children once they get to that level, once they've passed BBYO or whatever it is that they belong to be a part of Reform Judaism?
The simple answer is not enough. The reform movement just a few years ago, 10 years ago? I forgot. Anyway, in the last 10, 12 years, eliminated its college outreach program, which was colossally dumb. Now, I have to say something that, again, I don't want to be quoted outside of the room, but one of the attractions for Chabad is food and, more importantly, drink. Because, I mean, I'm, spent a number of years in Nashville as the Jewish chaplain for Vanderbilt. Volunteer. I mean, I had a full-time job, and Chabad was off campus, but I mean a block off campus. And why did the kids go? Because on Shabbat they got schnapps, or whatever they were drinking. Maybe, I don't know what it was. I never went. But the point was that was a draw for young kids who couldn't drink legally or on campus, but they could go there. I'm not speaking at all. They have a marvelous success story of friendship, welcoming people and hospitality and all those things. But one of the draws when you're a college student is you can go there for a little, don't take this wrong. I'm not trying to judge your students, but having been on the other side of that one, what do? At Vanderbilt, we had a Shabbat dinner every single week now for 25 years, all for free, right? And the same level of hospitality, and welcoming and classes and all the things that Rabbi Joseph does so well. But this Chabad still was that draw because we didn't serve alcohol. That's not a judgment on your granddaughters. I'm just saying to you, in a meta sense, that's been a real issue. But the specifics to your question, that the reform movement not only has dropped the ball, it has just kicked it away, and it's very sad. That was a tremendous mistake.
Just as a follow-on
Yeah.
to that, they get a choice. Like one of my oldest granddaughter is in Pittsburgh. She's at the University of Pittsburgh, and she was brought up conservative and very active in Jewish organizations in high school. And her choice is, I mean, this is a city that has a lot of synagogues, but they don't go to the synagogue, so it's not, she belongs to a Jewish sorority, and they all go to Chabad because the food at Hillel is not good enough. You know?
I can tell you the food at Hillel in Nashville was better than Chabad because it had our best caterer in the whole community, and she does it as a service to the community. But again, I don't know about Pitt. It's a real problem, and it's a problem on a whole bunch of levels, not just, hospitality and membership and joining. It's what do you go to a Jewish central position? What do you go for? And if it's friendship, if it's food, if it's drink, whatever it is. But Chabad has been, and by the way, I'll tell you one of the other problems, a lot of Chabad is funded by the Russian oligarch Jews. I'm not saying it didn't start that way, but a lot of their money is these billionaire Russian Jews who are supporting Chabad, and they've also done one thing we never did. And the Chabad leadership historically was going after wealthy Reform families and saying, we're the real Jews, you're not. Give us money to help us spread the message. So they are masterful fundraisers. No question about that. Yes?
Is there an equivalent for music between World War I and World War II concerning music? There were people went out and did photographic surveys of the European communities, well known. Was there an equivalent for music?
Oh, in terms of collecting the music? Yes, yes. The Smithsonian was one place that did a lot of that collecting. Vitso, another group that did collection of this music. Check the Milken collection online because they have that kind of, the period of that music also on albums. Okay? Not to the same breadth as the written documents, but yes. And one of the things you'll see, because I'm doing some of that music of American songwriters from pre-World War I to pre-World War II, and that's some of the stuff we'll do this afternoon. Yes?
Why did the Reform movement abandon HUC in Cincinnati and move to LA?
Well, let's be careful of the words. What they abandoned, and of course this directly influenced me, since I was the dean of the head of the rabbinical school, was they got rid of the rabbinical program in Cincinnati and then the graduate school in Cincinnati and moved it to New York and LA. It has been said it was for economic reasons, but that wasn't the case. I think it was more of a focus of New York leadership moving the program to New York City and away from Cincinnati. One of the sad things is that, and Linda can speak to this very, very clearly, the Cincinnati, as early as 1883, was sending students from Cincinnati to serve Jewish little congregations all over the South, the Midwest, the Rocky Mountains, and they would go every 2 weeks. What's fascinating is our earliest two still, well, till recently, getting rabbinical students. One was New Iberia, Louisiana, and the other one was Portsmouth, Ohio. Now, where's that? That's on the Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, that little corner of the three. And New Iberia was a schlep because those people were taking a train to get all the way down there in 1883. That's when they began. And you know that the red sauce, the spicy Tabasco, that's where it's from, New Iberia. So that's where the Jewish money was in hot sauce. Not for me, but for them. Anyway, that was the major problem when that program was shut down, because we don't serve that community anymore. And that's, you know, I don't have a better answer that's not politically one-sided from my perspective. So I'll drop it from there, except it's very sad. Very sad. Yes, sir.
Can the Reform community in the diaspora survive without a thriving Reform community in Israel?
The truthful answer is yes. The emotional, spiritual answer is no. But I do think that the Reform movement in America grew exponentially without Israel. Now remember, you've got to, don't mix up the hope for Israel and the governmental state land of Israel. Because Reform never got rid of its hope and prayer for Israel, meaning next year in Jerusalem, they didn't literally mean we'd all be on King David Street for next year's Passover, but it was a spiritual connectedness. Do I ever want to have that question have to be asked in person, you know, reality? Of course not. But I do think that Jews have continued to find hope wherever they were. To Rabbi's sermon last night. One of our teachers used to say, you know, whenever the first Jew got anywhere and landed on that beach, the very first Jew, who was there to meet him? The Jew who got there before him to hit him up for the UJA. I mean, that was, so I don't know. I hope we never have to face that, but do I think it could exist in a different form than we have now? Yes. But I don't want, obviously, to ever see that happen. So I don't know that Rabbi would agree with that answer, but I think, you know, Judaism has existed for thousands of years before the creation of the state. I just don't want to ever see that challenge in front of us. What a depressing way to end my time with you this morning. Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you later.
So, Jim was going to make some announcements. Jim, I promised you could make some announcements. But before he comes and makes announcements, let me tell you about the rest of the day, and I'll sort of fill in the time until Jim gets here. We are going to have lunch from 12 to 1. I'm not promising the level of catering, but I have catered lunch. You know, it's hard catering for 100 people without your own kitchen here and having to bring things from home, but I hope you enjoy it. Everything is vegetarian. If you are gluten-free, come talk to me. If you are vegan, come talk to me. I can tell you what's vegan and what's gluten-free. There is soup. There are 2 salads. There's hummus. There's tzatziki. There's some homemade bread rolls. There's some leftover bagels. I believe there's some pita and falafel from another occasion last week. And so there's a lot of food there. But what is probably the thing that you're going to be least familiar with, because you know what soup is, right? Is I made a shamishi cake, which is a Lebanese cake. So you take a very small slice, put a bit of strawberry sauce on it, a little bit of creme fraiche on it, and a little bit of sprinkle of pistachio. If you don't like any of those, just leave it off. It's a very rich semolina cake that has been soaked in Rosewater and all sorts of things. So that's probably the thing that's going to be most unfamiliar to people. You're going to look and go, what? So please enjoy. It was my honor to do this in honor of my dad, as Rabbi Cantor knows my mother. I don't know if you know this about my mother's family. So my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was head of the culinary school in Australia until she got married. And then she and my grandfather ran hotels. So my mother was always able to cater for the community, and so it's my honor and her honor to do that for you in honor of my dad. Thank you for that privilege. And then at 2 o'clock we'll come back for the second half of the program. You have some announcements, and then we'll say more. Yes, I'm sorry, 1 o'clock.
I just wanted to thank everybody. I will tell you that lunch today is better than Panera. She's really great. You should see this. I do want to thank especially Gail Miller, who's out there working hard, and my committee. Bob Linder and Sylvia Locke and Bob Ginsberg and Nancy Cutler, and I'm sure I'm leaving a couple out. Hal Castle, who is a special advisor to the committee, and Bob Hurwitz, who does all the work with the coffee each and every time. He's really terrific. He always shows up and saves me from going to Dunkin' Donuts. And of course, we want to thank our wonderful Rabbi Joseph, and Rabbi Cantor, who is going to present a wonderful talk and music this afternoon. So we're very lucky to have this. We're very lucky that Rabbi Joseph knows Rabbi Cantor and helped invite him. So thank you very much. We have
it's a good
I
question.
don't know if you know this is where Rabbi Stevens who preceded you in Nashville.
Yes.
Right here.
She is?
No, Rabbi Hughes
I know Rabbi Hughes.
started right here.
Oh, yes, I did. I was trying to say.
Actually, he was in Detroit there last week.
Yeah. Oh, he was in Nashville, right? He was the rabbi. Wow. Oh, is that right?
Oh, okay. I couldn't say I thought you did when you were deep temple.
Well, I was, but that was before he got.
Oh, okay.
He came 2 rabbis after I did. So I was.
But things worked out.
Very well. Yeah, I know.
But the question is, I think the difference between the old story and what we talk about today
I mean, there's a microphone.
So what should I talk about the story when we come back? The American Jewish reaction.
Oh, yeah.
The whole debate in America.
That's great. You're a good dog parent. Rabbi, I want to get you in line.
Well, I'm Kennedy George Grover. I've got 1,000 questions for you, but I'll limit it to two.
Cardiologist, we're going to watch out.
The second one's easier to answer. Herzl was not a great historian.
drop that name fast.
Yeah, yeah, well, I was coming over with Benjamin
It's a
first.
shame that Gail Boyer isn't here. It's a shame that Gail Boyer isn't here, because when I was involved with Temple Lake 50 years ago, I hate to say, she was the one who carried the bill for you know, and because 90% of the congregation was, and he wasn't an ordained cantor, what we had is kind of phrase conservative. And most of these people are derivative of that.
Yeah.
We're all conservative. I mean, so as a leader, you have to do with, you have to do with things. It seems like they're over there, you know, they're slow, their interests are my interests, and still, you know,
Truth of the matter is,
we have to listen
in
to them
America,
also.
until pretty much World War II, the majority of Jews in America were classical reform Jews, overwhelming. And then the conservative movement came in big time in the 1920s.
Yeah, well, I'll talk about this, but, but Henrietta's sister.
programs. The programs in my office. I'll go get them.
Your food was great, thank you.
Sorayim Tov, everybody. Good afternoon. Shabbat Shalom again. You get to see me. Hi. I hope everybody enjoyed the lunch. I hope you're welcome. Yay. I've already said I'm not catering the next bar mitzvah here. So just so you know, coming around are these lovely programs that Rabbi Cantor brought with him. He'll talk a little bit about them. They've got words to some songs that you may be familiar with, that you know. If everybody wants to come in and take a seat, I will introduce him in a minute or two. Let's bench after meals. The short benching, my friends. Brich Rachamana Malka de Ama Mare de Haipita. We give thanks to God for the bread that we have eaten. How many people were not here this morning? A few. All right. So as I'm waiting for Rabbi Cantor to come back into the room, let me do a short introduction, which he won't get to hear, so he won't blush. I was explaining this morning that Rabbi Cantor and I go back a long way. He and I met when I was 11, 12 years old, which gives you some idea of how long we have known each other. And he became a very close and dear friend of my parents and myself and my brother. When he was a student rabbi in Australia a long time ago. I have to go back through your biography. There's a whole lot of people that weren't here. He has been a congregational rabbi in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and in Nashville. He has worked as at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Jewish Institute of Religion as chair of the rabbinic department there. Looking after all the rabbinic students for 20 years. He now works for Roots of Reform Judaism, which is a wonderful organization that preserves their history and also thinks about Reform Judaism today and its meaning. And one of the things that he started doing, I can't even tell you how many years ago, but he certainly was doing it when he was in Australia, when the second time he came out, was he was writing his thesis on the Jews of Tin Pan Alley, which actually became a book. And he started doing, he's very talented, and he started doing these talks and discussions around the Jews of Tin Pan Alley. And he's been collecting that music and researching that for many years now. I won't even say how many years. You can figure it out since he's known me since I was 11. And And one of the things that I thought would be amazing when he and I talked was for him to bring that show, which he does all around the country and has done internationally, because I can say, at least I know you've done it in Australia. You may have done it in other places too. And bring it to us. It is such an enjoyable and fantastic learning program, so I hope you enjoy it. One more thing. One of the reasons that I wanted Rabbi Cantor here was to honor my late father, Peter Joseph. Rabbi Cantor was a great friend of my family. He knew my father well and loved my father, as well as working with my mother. And it was very important to me that whoever the scholar was, because the congregation kindly donated money in memory of my father, that money went towards someone that came as a scholar, that knew my dad, and that could just smile at being here, because we're doing the mitzvah of increasing his memory by your learning. So thank you also for being here with me tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi, very much. You know, when you do your rabbinic dissertation, your thesis, they want you to do something intellectually important. So I was trying to think, actually I'm going to go back a little bit further. I was in Israel, as Linda said, for my first year of rabbinical school, and one of the requirements was to do a lecture in modern Jewish thought. And so I'm trying to think, what modern Jewish thought did I ever have that I could teach to anybody? And so I decided the one thing I knew a lot about that no one else really did was the Jewish contribution to Broadway. So I went home over winter break, and I recorded onto my recording, my little tape recorder, people like Ethel Merman and Mary Martin and Ezio Pinza and all these great stars, all of whom were singing songs from Broadway, all of them written by Jews. So my lecture was called The Jews on Broadway, We Jews on Broadway. So I did it in Jerusalem. Now let me just tell you how long ago this was, because I didn't sing, I just talked. I gave my little lecture, and then I turned on my cassette recorder, put it up against the microphone, and here are all these people listening to my little tape recorder on the microphone, and no one thought that was weird. And so I did this program, and it was very well received, and we had a couple hundred people in the chapel, the Merstein Chapel at HUC in Jerusalem. And the dean said, you know, that was so well received, let's do it again, but for the public. So they started putting ads around Jerusalem, like on the bus stations. There was, you know, Kenneth Cantor in Hebrew, Broadway, and we had 400 people show up, and they all sat there and listened to my little tape recorder. I mean, it was like a different world. I come back to Cincinnati, and I got invited to do a program at the Golden Ager Group for the Conservative Synagogue in Cincinnati. Very conservadox. It was more traditional than just conservative. And I went over there and had all this stuff and it was Shabbat afternoon, so it was like an Oneg Shabbat for the Golden Agers. And I walk in with my little tape recorder, and the rabbi meets me at the door, and he looks at the tape recorder and he says, "Was ist das? What is this?" And I said, "Well, it's my program." He said, "You can't use a tape recorder in a conservative synagogue on Shabbat. And you can't use a microphone. You didn't come earlier yesterday to set up the microphone." So I have now, give or take, 400 people, all of whom are 80 and above. And I have no program because I can't play the music, and I'm suddenly forced with singing all the songs. A cappella, no piano, no nothing, no tape recorder. But as someone said to me, "Rabbi, the way you sing and the way they hear, it's a perfect match." So we are blessed that we have a marvelous pianist, Kyle Pedrick over there, and two marvelous singers, one you hear regularly, as you did last night with Beth Rubens, and someone you hear conducting and organizing the choir with Michaela Wilson. We are very grateful that both of them and all of them are part of this program, and you are going to be more grateful that they are here even than I am, because you don't have to listen to me all the time. So we're talking about Tin Pan Alley. And where did that name come from? Well, I'm going to start with a bunch of names you've never heard. At least I think you've never heard, because here's one. Tin Pan Alley was invented by a newspaper reporter who wrote for one of the newspapers in New York City by the name of Monroe Rosenfeld. How many of you know Monroe? Good. Okay. Monroe was famous as a reporter, as I said, and he was sent to the two greatest songwriters of the 19th century, Jewish songwriters of the 19th century, who wrote in Lower Manhattan, and their names were the Von Tilzer brothers. And I'm fairly safe in guessing that you've never heard of them either. But you have, because one of the Von Tilzers is a young man who wrote a song that you have heard every time you go to a baseball game and they stand up at the seventh